Everyone, and welcome to Cold War Spaces. This is Cold War Spaces number 40. I'm Anna Rose, Exhibition and Programming Associate at the Wende. Today's topic is Spaces of Global Socialism, World-Making Architecture. And we're happy to welcome Łukasz Stanek as senior lecturer, or as our guest today. He's senior lecturer, the American version of associate professor at the University of Manchester in the UK. He authored the book Henri Lefebvre on Space, Architecture, Urban Research, and the Production of Theory from 2011 and University of Minnesota Press. And what you saw at the beginning as you were joining, the book Architecture and Global Socialism, Eastern Europe, West Africa, and the Middle East in the Cold War, from Princeton University Press in 2020. And that book won the Alice Davis Hitchcock Medallion by the SAHGB and the RIBA President's Award for History and Theory Research. Currently, Stanek studies the Africanization of Ghanaian architecture as part of the Centering Africa program at the Canadian Centre for Architecture. Besides Manchester, he taught at the ETH Zurich, Harvard University GSD, and the University of Michigan. And he'll be joined in conversation today by Segal, the Wende's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. It'll be about a 30-minute conversation between the two. And after that, we'll leave about 15 minutes for Q&A. So please get your questions ready to go in the Q&A box during that time. We appreciate everyone's questions. Please keep them short though, no longer than a sentence or two so that we can try to get to everyone's. And for other comments and discussion, please use the chat box. And as we're getting started, feel free to say hi and what city you're tuning in from. Also, we'll be posting the recording of this program on our Vimeo page afterwards, as well as in podcast format on our SoundCloud. Lastly, I'd like to thank Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And now Yus will get us started with the conversation. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Anna Rose and Łukasz. Welcome to Cold War Spaces. Great to have you here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I would like to start actually, if I may, with the very first sentence of your introduction, which is a quote from an architect from Ghana you interviewed. And he said, "I remember very well these Eastern European architects because it was the first and the last time that a white man had an African boss in Ghana." So why did you decide to open your book with this very quote?
Yes, this was a very striking sentence, which made quite an impression on me. The man who said that was a draftsman at the Ghana National Construction Corporation in the 1960s. So after the independence, and that corporation was headed by a Ghanaian architect, but the majority of architects employed were coming from Eastern Europe, from Poland, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and Hungary. And this sentence was really quite striking to me because of a number of reasons. First, because it conveyed a sense of rupture that took place after independence, but also a sense that that rupture was an intermezzo, if you like. And so it conveyed very well both the promise and the disappointment of decolonization, and that is very much one of the kind of topics of the book. Secondly, it was really useful because it really pointed at labor relationships, in this case labor in an architectural office, and that perspective on labor is really something which I developed in the book too. And finally, I thought, the way how he framed it and he commented about this made me think that this was really about the everyday experience of work, one which was really spatial, and so one which really related to the very specific spaces in the office, how they were organized, who moved and how between these spaces, and so on. And so to my mind, that was really what decolonization meant. Namely a reorganization of spaces and times of everyday life. Right. And this is why and this is a perspective I really also developed in the book.
Right. So there are many very interesting and also, at least to me, very surprising insights in the book. One of the things that struck me is that so many developing countries were working with architects and institutions from the capitalist West, from the communist countries, and from the non-aligned countries, sometimes at the very same time. And you also emphasize in your book that different countries from the Soviet bloc had different roles at the same time, were competing with each other. Reading that, I wondered, how do you view the standard interpretation of Cold War history as this bipolar model of East versus West? And is it maybe about time that we come up with a different model, and how would that look like?
Right. Yes, that's really quite crucial. I do believe that bipolarity was relevant for many places as an overarching framework, as a reference point for many global south countries, global south leaders. There was a number of places which really needed to, pick a side, if you like, because of geopolitics, because of military reasons, and so on. But the countries which I focused on were neither proxies nor satellites of any of the superpowers. So I write about Ghana, Nigeria, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait. They were all non-aligned countries. Some of them, of course, like Ghana, closer to the Soviets, others like the UAE, really very far. But nevertheless, leaders in these countries, all of them worked across geopolitical divides. So I think that, there are like two lessons from this. First, evidently the superpowers were not equal. And secondly, bipolarity was quite often a leverage for global south decision makers. And they were able to refer to this image of bipolarity in order to extract resources. And that included the American-Soviet divides, but also many others. As you mentioned, by the 1960s, there were many socialisms. There was a Soviet socialist, there was a Chinese socialist, there was a non-aligned socialist or self-managed socialism. Mm-hmm. But also, and I think that's quite important too, on the other side, the main competitors, economic competitors of the United States were Western Europeans and the Japanese, and not the Soviets, for example, right? And so that economic competition was another really important part, and architecture and construction is a kind of really good perspective on that too.
Right. So bipolarity did exist, but it was actually a construction that could be used in a strategic way.
Yes, and it was very, very much used.
Right. So one of the concepts you introduce in your book is the concept of worldmaking, which is also part of the title of today's program. You used it to describe the always changing dynamic global relations. Why this term worldmaking? What does it bring?
Yeah, I introduced it in kind of relationships, or in like building upon of the work of a number of theorists and writers. And so I understand world making as an emergence of the world as a dimension of practice. And communication and transportation and so on, these are important things. But what I stressed in the book were really ideas and visions of global collaboration and solidarity, which were practiced in very specific ways. And so the book is basically about how these various, sometimes antagonistic, sometimes competing visions of the world were practiced by Eastern Europeans, by West Africans, and by Middle Easterners. And that, again, could go into various directions. That could go into, that did include the socialist development model as potentially applicable worldwide. And that's really very much the driver of most of the Soviet projects that I described. But I also look at other things. I looked at how people from regions which were traditionally seen as peripheral or underdeveloped and dominated by Western Europe recognized themselves as being in the majority, if you like, being the majority world. And now this is a crucial point, and how they acted, through this recognition, and very specifically how they picked up at certain architectural tools and instruments based on these visions of the world.
Right, so could you say that world making is actually about the construction of the world based on different and competing narratives about the world?
Yes, yes, absolutely. And you know, for example, picking up on the last one, the one which kind of recognized those, if you like, oblique relationships between what was called at the time the second and the third world. It is because of this recognition that you know, Eastern Europeans and West Africans, let's say, were able to go back to or at least, you know, tried to reactivate architectural cultures in Central and Eastern Europe, which tried to, you know, deal with questions of nation buildings, of cultural emancipation, of economic modernization. So, you know, challenges which Eastern Europeans face and dealt with, for instance, since the late 19th century during the interwar period, and all challenges which became so urgent in the course of decolonization.
Right, great. So speaking specifically about architecture and urban planning, could you say there were certain advantages or maybe also drawbacks for developing countries to choose a collaboration either with the capitalist West or the communist countries?
Yes, that's I think a really complex question. You know, so on the one hand, there was this you know, an established tradition, for instance, in architecture, say tropical architecture, tropical modernism, which was coming from basically the former colonial countries, which had that competence of dealing with specific climatic conditions, specific technological conditions, and, you know, with time, perhaps even with certain social conditions in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance. There was also quite a widespread consensus, if you like, that Western goods and technology were more advanced than Eastern European ones, and that was acknowledged by Eastern European managers. So, for example, I remember, you know, reading somebody writing, "Our factories are 3 times heavier than, you know, the Western ones." This is the Buckminster-Fuller type of criterion for architectural success. But what we need to also kind of remember is that other things mattered too, right? That these countries were really decolonizing countries were really concerned about, you know, what Nkrumah called neo-colonialism, so the persistent influence of the former colonizers. They were also, you know, they were also unable to get particular goods from the West. The conditions of trade mattered. You know, I describe in the book how the principle of barter, so the exchange of things without the mediation of money, was really, really useful, both for the so-called second and the third world, because it allowed them to save on convertible currencies. But also, and this is my final point, we have to remember that sometimes global South countries actually preferred, you know, less advanced technologies. Why? Because they were quite often labor intensive. And so they allowed them to employ the surplus labor.
Oh, that's interesting. Right, right. So how would you describe the role of the architects from the Soviet bloc countries in, say, West Africa and the Middle East? Were they more or less representatives of their socialist states, or did they have a more independent role, and did they develop in a certain more autonomous direction?
Yes, a really important distinction which I make in the book is and again within that perspective on labor that I mentioned, are kind of 2 types of labor, 2 types of contracts, if you like, very generally speaking, for Eastern European architects, for architects from socialist countries. And so some of them were directly employed by Ghanaian, Nigerian, Iraqi design offices, administration, and universities. Others were really employees in Eastern Europe of, you know, Eastern European design institutes, which were then commissioned for typically, you know, big designs, like a whole neighborhood in Accra or the master plan of Baghdad. And because of these different conditions of work, of course, their relationship to the socialist states and the bureaucracies also were different, right? And so if, to come back to your first question, an architect had a Ghanaian boss, that meant that their loyalties lied elsewhere. And I have seen, they quite often the loyalties lie precisely with the Ghanaians rather than with the representatives of, a particular embassy. I did read some instructions of I think a Polish embassy, which tried to persuade Polish architects in Nigeria to convince those ministers, they supervisors to buy Polish machinery and construction materials. But precisely these instructions kind of also express frustrations that Polish architects weren't doing that. And so you see that precisely because of the different types of contracts and labor relationships, these loyalties also were shifting.
Right. You could argue that Western Africa was of limited geopolitical importance to the Soviet Union. Why is it that the Soviet Union nonetheless invested so much, in this case, in terms of architecture and urban planning, in helping or supporting these countries?
Yeah, I mean, we are specifically talking about the 1960s, the early 1960s. So really part of the big Khrushchev era diplomatic offensive in the region, and there was a number of reasons. Ideology was clearly important. This was really a test case. These three countries were a test case for the promotion of the socialist development model, and that model included industrialization, collectivization of agriculture, welfare distributions, and hence architecture and construction were really important in the implementation of this model and its adaptation to the local conditions, because that was really a kind of key point that everybody understood. Certainly, the Soviet decision makers understood that, and certainly the Ghanaian counterparts and the Nigerian counterparts, and rather counterparts in Bamako or Conakry understood that this model needs to be adapted. Right. But also, already at that time, economy was important. So under Khrushchev, the Soviet offers were very generous, but that's also quite clear that the Soviets were hoping that in time, in a long-term perspective, there will be economic gains, raw materials or in markets for the goods. And these gains often did not materialize precisely because of politics, which was moving much faster than these plans, including the 1966 coup in Ghana, which cut short the big projects of the Soviets.
Right. Well, one of the other very interesting points in your book, I thought, was the fact that some architects from Eastern Europe working in Africa didn't try to convince African architects and colleagues that they should follow communism or socialism, but they actually made the claim that they were more or less in a comparable situation as Eastern Europe was colonized by the Soviet Union, and African countries were colonized by Western European countries. So they actually made the point that they had a shared experience. Were they allowed to do this? I mean, didn't they have any repercussions from their countries by bringing up this argument? And how effective was it to come up with this argument in West African countries?
Yes, that's a complicated, very complicated questions. I try to be really brief about this. Well, first, there's this claim of a certain historical affinity, even similarity between Eastern Europe and, speaking about Nigeria, West Africa, was really part of the state socialist propaganda. And of course, then they did not refer to Soviet colonization. That would be unthinkable, but they referred to the longer 19th century history of the region as part of, the Western European empires, the Tsarist Empire and the Ottoman Empire. Some architects, including one of the protagonists of my book, the Hungarian architect Charles Poloni, did refer to Soviet colonialism, but that would certainly not be a discourse that would be encouraged by anybody in Eastern Europe. That discourse actually does appear on the other side as a part of the Cold War debate and really Cold War ideology. So that's one part. And now the second, I think, important point here is that, which I try to make, as strongly as I can, is that this is not just about ideology or propaganda. At least that's not the part which is most interesting to me. The part which I'm interested in is precisely what I mentioned before: how these type of claims, speculative and questionable as they are, how they allow for people who really didn't know much about the spaces they kind of arrived to, people who were literally thrown into a very unknown, unfamiliar situations, that these claims allow them to think about how to deal with the challenges on the ground. And so, for example, they, precisely because of that longer perspective towards the 19th century, they were able to think about, techniques of rural planning, or survey techniques, as I discussed, survey techniques of vernacular architecture, which was then seen as a nation-building resource or as a modernization resource. And finally, what I also try to show in this chapter is that these attempts confronted the protagonists of my book with the ambiguity of the colonial histories of Eastern Europe itself, notably the so-called internal colonization in Poland or in the interwar period. And so this, raises the question whether you can be a colonizer at home and a decolonizer abroad.
Yeah, another great example, I would say, of your concept of world making here. Let's talk a little bit about your chapter on Baghdad. You say that at first sight, Baghdad seems a perfect example of a very efficient division of tasks between different Soviet bloc countries being active there. But then you argue that's actually not so much the case, because they were fiercely competing against each other. And that's brought the question home for me: did they actually act like capitalist countries there, trying to outbid each other?
Right. I mean, profit was clearly by that time, in the wake of the oil crisis and the debt crisis in Eastern Europe, profit, specifically profit in convertible currency, which can be used for debt repayment, was really a kind of key motivation for these individual, economic actors, design institutes, contractors, construction companies from socialist countries. So, at one point I asked a Bulgarian manager of one of these companies whether, the company collaborated with other state socialist companies in Libya, where he was based, and he, just laughed and said that, he considered these other companies from socialist Europe as direct competitors. Also because they were, quite similar in terms of their profile. And so that really contrasted with this official discourse of the Socialist International Division of Labor and the attempts to coordinate the economies, including construction economies, of the socialist countries. And so in really contrast to this discourse, in particular oil producing countries in North Africa and the Middle East, these companies competed against each other. And what is kind of interesting is that when new patterns of division of labor between them, they were emerging. But of course, these patterns had nothing to do with these attempts at coordination of their work.
Right. So in your final chapter, which deals with Abu Dhabi and Kuwait City, you claim that East European architects were actually not using any socialist ideology anymore. They were just competing with Western and East Asian architects on a similar basis. How successful were they in this competition?
Yes, I decided to look at the Gulf, which was not a big market, right? In comparison to Libya or Syria or Iraq and Algeria at the time, that was not really a very big market at all. But I decided to focus on it because cities like Dubai or Abu Dhabi are really seen as the forefront of architecture's globalization by the end of the 20th century. So I was really curious about that connection. And actors from socialist countries were really very, very different in terms of the success, if you like, in the Gulf. For instance, East Germans were very eager to enter the Gulf, but they very much struggled. I think that they were hindered by the bureaucracy, by the very long chains of command, by huge aversion of spending hard currency. But I also thought that East German decision makers were really reluctant to accept contracts which somehow contradicted the self-perception of East Germany as a really technologically advanced country. By contrast, Bulgarian design institutes were in charge of, if you like, some of the most prestigious buildings in the UAE, of city halls in Abu Dhabi and Al Ain, and they won these commissions in open international competitions. And so and the argument of the chapter, or one of them, is that while the Bulgarians, as you said, did not refer to socialism, the success in the Gulf was possible because of the previous experience in the region, in Arab countries, in the networks of socialist internationalism.
Right. Thank you. So we are about to move to the Q&A, and if you have questions, please put them under the Q&A box, that is where I'm going to look. But before we go there, let me ask you one final question. How would you judge that East European architects, urban planners who had this experience in West Africa and the Middle East could use that after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of state socialism, when they all of a sudden had to work in a capitalist environment? How did they do that?
Yeah, I think that, by talking to people of the youngest generation, I realized that work abroad, at least in some countries, and precisely work in the Middle East and North Africa, was really a generational experience for many of them. And after the end of socialism, many of them returned. And that experience became really useful, and that included knowledge of modern building technologies, materials, programs, middle-class housing, modern office parks, and these kind of things. But also, I'm very interested in the use of computer-aided software, which was really commercially implemented in the Gulf, a kind of very fast-moving construction market. And this is where many of the people I interviewed really learned that software and then used it in Eastern Europe in the 1990s. Also quite important were links to contractors and developers who are operating in the oil-producing countries, and then they were moving into Eastern Europe in the course of the 1990s. But I also wondered at the same time, to what extent these experiences had an impact on the ways in which these architects understood their own profession. In other words, to what extent it. I was wondering that many architects whom I interviewed, really kind of accepted, even embraced the type of creative destruction of socialism that happened in the 1990s in the course of the shock therapies in Poland and other places. And I wondered to what extent the experience of working in these oil booming countries, a very specific type of positionality vis-a-vis the commissioners, vis-a-vis the developers, while being at the same time very isolated from the broad public. To what extent, this experience also shaped that enthusiasm with which they were really ready to let go of a lot of what probably would be considered today real achievements of socialism.
Right. Thanks. Thank you. The first question we have is from Bruce Hollingham. He writes, "Hello, Dr. Stanek. I don't know if you're familiar with the acute shortage of housing in Los Angeles, where over 150,000 people are homeless. Are you familiar with this situation? And if so, what do you think of the possibility of creation of industrialized, prefabricated, large-scale housing blocks known as Khrushchevka as a possible solution?" I don't know if you're, what can you say about that?
That's, well, I certainly can say something about that, even if that was not really the part of my book. But perhaps what is relevant, it actually is a bridge to my book, is that when I visited Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia, which is not really part of my book, but it was useful for me to look at Mongolia because of other reasons. One of the places I visited was a factory of large scale prefab, precisely a factory built during the Khrushchev period with 100% Soviet technology. And that factory, by the end of the 20th century was basically abandoned. And now when I visited it 4 or 5 years ago, it was modernized, and it was really kind of rediscovered as a resource for precisely dealing with the housing crisis in Ulaanbaatar, which is very acute, and of course that technology was modernized in terms of insulation and quality of the windows and the quality of the joints and so on and so on. But nevertheless, the basic technology and the idea that large-scale prefab is the solution was very much there. So I don't know, what it says about LA, but there are definitely places in the world where clever people understand how useful that type of technology can be if updated.
Yeah, well, maybe LA should ask Mongolia for support here. The next question is by Vladimir Paperny. What initially attracted you to the subject of East European involvement in the third world countries?
Thank you. Hi, Vladimir. Thank you for the question. As with many, I think all big projects, this project has many starting points, and some of them are more, if you like, related to history of architecture, which is, an incredibly biased discipline, an incredibly kind of myopic discipline in terms of what the case studies are, what the references are, and as everybody who I think, as many of you teachers at a global school of architecture, this myopic tradition of architectural history really contrasts with the cosmopolitan character of a school, of students, and so that was one of the clearly reasons. But perhaps the most immediate one and the more personal one was that when I was still a student of architecture, I was really interested in Nowa Huta, which is this new town in Poland built during the early socialist period. And so I studied Nowa Huta, and I realized that the next big project of the very design institute which designed Nowa Huta was the master plan of Baghdad. And that was something I never heard of. And so that was really, I was very curious about that. That's basically how it started.
Thank you. Next question is by Susanne Altman. Have you researched the history of the Aswan Dam, where the Soviet Union would outbid the US and also employ East German contractors like engineers? Is it true that the Soviet power plant was less effective, even damaging to agriculture, than the American version would have been?
Thank you. I didn't specifically look at the Aswan Dam, but I think there are scholars who did look at this particular project. But it is true that there is a number of things one can say about this. First, the dams were really, if you like, an export product by the Soviet Union, and one which one can see in a number of places, including Syria, including Iraq. So that was one of the questions which I was really interested in, was really the division of labor between the countries, and if that term is acceptable, then I would argue that dams and large infrastructural works were really part of if you like, the key Soviet offer. And at the same time, you are right that in these projects the Soviets subcontracted it or assigned certain tasks within this very, very complex project of a dam, which of course is not simply the object itself, but also the whole infrastructure which needs to support it, including housing, including perhaps, you know, a town. And this is what I looked at briefly, and I briefly mentioned in my book, in Syria, where there are certain architects and planners from Syria and from other socialist countries were assigned the tasks besides the Soviet engineer and the main construction of the infrastructural object.
Thank you. We have a question from Ben Brown. What is being done to preserve these examples of socialist architecture in these non-aligned third world countries? And what is the future for these buildings? And is the history of socialist architecture widely recognized in these countries?
Yes, I think this is a really important question. I think that there, in many countries, in particular the one which perhaps I know best, which is Ghana, this is an architecture which is really associated with the first decade of independence, with a really heroic period of independence. That is an architecture which is really acknowledged and accepted as Ghanaian architecture, as opposed to, you know, colonial architecture. So on the one hand, there is this great respect for Nkrumah and for the foundations of the country from which Ghana continues to benefit until today. But on the other hand, Ghana, Accra, and other places in the region are undergoing incredibly rapid urbanization processes. And so there is that conflict where this architecture quite often loses. And I'm looking quite closely at a number of projects in really strategic places in Accra today, which were developed, sometimes not fully realized, during the Nkrumah period. And today, they are really kind of major hubs of investments. And some of my friends in Accra really are very concerned about how this heritage is being dealt with, but also they are concerned about the contrast between the really egalitarian and inclusive programs of these buildings during the Nkrumah period, and you know, the very exclusive types of enclaves that are being built today.
Thank you. The next question is by Marty Zisner. How did the socialist Eastern Bloc companies in Africa interact with fellow socialist country Israel, doing economic diplomacy, expanding their foreign policy?
Yes, that's a really good question. So if you remember, I have mentioned this company, which was called the Ghana National Construction Corporation, which was that major actor, I think main actor under Nkrumah in terms of architecture, but also construction, maintenance of building. Now, the origin of this company is quite interesting because it emerged from an Israeli Ghanaian company. And that Israeli Ghanaian company was created by an Israeli company, which was called Solel Bonech, which was a really an important company and kind of very self-consciously employed in Israeli diplomacy in Africa. And so after a few years, this Ghanaian Israeli company was nationalized in a friendly manner. And then it was merged with another kind of state institution in Ghana. And this is how the Ghana National Construction Corporation was created. And so that Israeli impulse and that, you know, imagination of a country that is a new country that has, as you said, very much egalitarian ambitions, that a country which was never a colonizing country as it was presented itself, as Israeli presented themselves in Africa, and there was that was really part of that cosmopolitan environment in Accra in the early independence period. Right. And of course, and I will end this with this, and I heard because of many of the Israeli engineers and architects who were in Accra were educated in Eastern Europe before they moved to Israel. There were all sorts of, if you like, linguistic alliances which happened, and I when I was interviewing some of the architects, I was told that at one point they realized that everybody around the table speaks Polish.
Interesting, right? So at this point there are no more questions under the Q&A, and it's almost time, but I would like to grab this opportunity to ask you one final question, which is more speculative. We spoke about the bipolar model of the Cold War, but you also mentioned in your book that your book offers a correction to the teleological historiography of Western architectural dominance. And that's a point you make very convincingly in your book. Would you say that this is an argument that is specific for architecture and urban planning, or has it much wider implications?
Thank you. So I believe that this book makes a contribution basically to three debates and three disciplines. First, to, as you say, architectural history, because it shows how socialist internationalism and the non-aligned movement really contributed to the process of modern architecture becoming worldwide, and then perhaps how this modern architecture was equally questioned globally. Secondly, I think that the kind of important debate which I would like to contribute to is, broadly speaking, urban studies. And I think today in urban studies, there are those two entrenched explanatory schemes that informed debates about worldwide urbanization. And these urbanization processes around the world are being explained either by the impact of the colonial encounter or by the globalization of capitalism. And so what the book tries to do is to really introduce socialist world making into the picture. And finally, I hope that this book can make a contribution to the history of the global Cold War, and in particular, to have a kind of more nuanced and contextual understanding of it, including its political economy. I believe that architecture is a really good research perspective because it really straddles so many scales, right? From the most intimate ones of where do you sleep, where do you cook, to the very large ones of national economy, geopolitics, and diplomacy. And in that way, architecture offers a both highly situated but also kind of interconnected perspective.
Right. Łukasz, I want to thank you for a wonderful and very insightful presentation. This was really great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks everybody for the questions.
So next week we have our next monthly Art Past Present interview, co-hosted by Farah Karapetian, and our guest is dancer Tara Pandya. She's a practicing dancer, but also a dance researcher and dance activist. She has been a solo dancer for Cirque du Soleil and specializes in Central Asian classical dance traditions. It's phenomenal what she does. So I hope you could join me there. And then the next Cold War Spaces interview in 2 weeks. My guest is historian Sudha Rajagopalan, a professor at the University of Amsterdam. And we will talk about the change of meaning of objects in different countries, specifically Soviet objects landing in India and Cuba. So that will be interesting as well, I think. I wish you a wonderful week and hope to see you soon.